So we are going to discuss this well-known classic that all of you are familiar with, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. So all of you have read it. So I would like to get some ideas from you, from the listeners, in what way we should go about. We have altogether 5 classes, 5 sessions. Well, at the beginning, I shall just give a background of how this work came to be written. The author, as you know, his name is Mahendranath Gupta, M for short. He was a contemporary of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, the teacher of Swami Vivekananda. He was by profession a teacher, a well-educated man, well acquainted with the Western classical philosophy, history and literature, especially English literature, and also the Oriental studies, Gita, Upanishads and other fundamental works of Vedantic tradition. So in a way, he was a role model of those days, the typical elites living the later half of 19th century in India. Well acquainted with the modern classical literature, familiar with European history, American history, philosophy and literature, and also India's traditional spiritual literature, classical literature, Gita, Upanishads and so on. He had a large family, and though a well-educated man, he found it very difficult to cope with some of his family problems. A large family, joint family in those days. So one day, his family squabbles, family situation became so critical that he left his home around midnight. He was living in the city of Calcutta. At that time, that was the capital of India, part of British Empire, in the later half of 19th century. The second decade of, in the 80s, let us say, in 1880s of 19th century, the 8th decade. Now, when he left his home, his wife also accompanied him. And they walked around the city at midnight, and finally they got a horse carriage, that was the common mode of transportation in those days, and reached his nephew's home. Nephew's name was Siddheswara Majunta. And there he stayed. Before that, he tried to take refuge in the house of a friend of his, but the friend was not so very hospitable. Because you may be his close friend, but you were not willing to meet you at midnight, coming with the wife. So this man, perhaps, he didn't express it in so many words, but he was such a sensitive, well-educated man like him. He felt and he left. And then finally he reached the home of his nephew, and there he stayed. Next day, his nephew suggested to him, let us take a walk along the banks of river Ganga, the holy river. And the temple, the Dakshineswar temple in which Sri Ramakrishna was living, was situated in the banks of this river. So as he walked from place to place along the banks of the river, he finally reached this temple, the temple of Mother Kali, where Sri Ramakrishna was living. And incidentally, his nephew told him, well, there is a holy man living here. Why don't you go and meet him? Let us meet him. Well, he was not much interested, but anyhow, the nephew suggested, and he went ahead. And as he was about to enter the room, he found a middle-aged man sitting there talking about God, religion, life, the meaning and significance of human existence, and so on. But he found there's a serene expression on his face, and the visitors were closely listening to him. And somehow Yam got attracted. Let us go in and see for some time. They didn't immediately enter. They said he must be talking to some of his people, and they went around, they visited the temples and returned, and they entered, talked for some time. Sri Ramakrishna asked him some questions, where you are coming from and so on. And he left, and that was the beginning of a new chapter in Yam's life. So you can see how a man gets a new life. So now the point is, Yam became an ardent disciple, a chronicler of Sri Ramakrishna's instructions, the author of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. His nephew who took him there probably never visited him again. We don't know. We don't know much about that. So that's how, in fact, the meaning and message of this incident is, every tragedy or every problem in life sometimes becomes an opening for a new life, a new chapter, opening a new chapter in our life. That means there is no such thing as an absolute dilemma or a tragedy in life. Every problem becomes an opportunity. Every crisis perhaps becomes the beginning of a new life, if you look at it from the proper perspective. That's how Yam happened to come in contact with Sri Ramakrishna. And gradually, he became a close disciple. He started visiting Sri Ramakrishna frequently. Whenever he got time, he was a busy man. Often he lost his job because he was not willing to accommodate people's views who were critical of Sri Ramakrishna. So he resigned his job. Again he got a job. Such things happen again and again. But he was a very busy man. Later, some of the great disciples of Sri Ramakrishna were introduced to him by this Mahendranath Gupta. Some of them were his students, some of them happened to visit him once, and he told them about a great holy man living here. Just imagine how it happened. Swami Vivekananda. Swamiji was a student, and one day one of his professors, perhaps a Scottish professor, was teaching him a well-known work of William Wordsworth, that's Excursion, in which the word trance is used, the mind going back to minds and so on. So his professor said, well, I can't explain the real implication of the word trance. It means some kind of transcendental experience which is indescribable, inexplicable, some kind of inner intuitive experience which is felt as full of blissfulness. So he told him, well, there is one man whom I know who had this experience, and he is living in Dakshineshwar. And Vivekananda, at that time Narendranath Datta, an agnostic and a student of the university, came to Sri Ramakrishna, and he was the one who became Vivekananda. So you can see in Yam's life. As I said, Yam had thought of giving up his life due to worldly problems, domestic problems. Now, one day, Yam was walking with Sri Ramakrishna, discussing various things. But Sri Ramakrishna could read his mind. And casually Sri Ramakrishna said, see, it's all God's will. You cannot have your own decision. So if you take refuge in God, even the most terrible sins, most terrible problems, crises and critical situations and dilemmas in life will vanish like clouds disappearing by the strong winds, by the blow of strong winds. When the strong wind blows, huge patches of clouds may vanish, get scattered away. Similarly, If you pray to God, then God's grace will shatter all the problems, will solve all the problems of human life. That is the beginning of a new life in him. M was wondering how this holy man came to know what was going on in his mind. Perhaps he had not even disclosed to his own nephew what the real intention of his leaving his own home at midnight. But Sri Ramakrishna could read his mind, and Sri Ramakrishna intuitively grasped the situation and gave him a new life. And he not only got a new life, he became a great saint. He became a guide, a friend and philosopher and teacher of innumerable disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. Not only monastic disciples, but also innumerable householder disciples. Swami Tattwamayananda has written a small book on M. Mahendranath Gupta. There he narrates the incident of how a Muslim devotee who was the principal of a college in Ooty is in southern India, happened to go to Calcutta and meet M and was completely transformed. I have got that book with me. I shall read out that portion later. He says, this principal of a college used to visit Ooty Ashrama, where Swami Tattwamayananda was in charge at those days. So he asked him, Swami asked this principal, how did you come to be attracted by Vedanta? Then he narrated his own incident. He went to Calcutta once, and there he was not able to get accommodation anywhere else, because traditional Hindu monasteries perhaps may not admit somebody belonging to maybe traditional, not Ramakrishna mission, traditional monasteries. So he went to M, the author of Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and there he listened to Mahendranath Gupta for a long time, and then at the end of the meeting he told, I came to Calcutta all the way to see the holy places, but I am a Muslim. When Mahendranath Gupta, oh, what is the matter? What's wrong there? You are a Vedantin, you are a devotee of God, you have a place. And he was accommodated in his home as his own, as a family member. He lived in M's home as a family member and was completely transformed. So see, this is the man who is responsible for the great spiritual classic that is in front of us, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. That's the uniqueness of the book. Because very often a problem in life appears to be a problem when we think that life can be without problems. A problem appears to be so insurmountable if we have the idea that there can be a life without any problem. But the moment we understand that problem is part of the game of human existence, just as there should be two sides to a coin, so also there can be a positive and also negative aspect in human life, then the problem is no more a problem. It becomes a creative crisis, something that we take in our stride. And one point that M used to stress again and again is, God doesn't come to you to solve your problem. So, see, if there is a problem in your home, electrical connection, you may call an electrical man, he comes and repairs it. A plumber may come and fix the machine. Such things do happen. God is not a troubleshooter, he's not a repairer whom you can hire. But God gives you the power to withstand the problems. That's a much more important thing. God gives us the ability, the spiritual strength to withstand problems. So problems appear to be no more problems. Problems continue to be problems. The moment we become strong enough, mentally strong enough, spiritually strong, then we find, oh, the problem is not a real problem. It is something that we can live with. So it's no more a problem. So Sri Ramakrishna says, if we can take refuge in God and do our work, our duty in this world with dedication, then there is no need to worry about. That is Sri Ramakrishna's special message. He doesn't ask us to leave behind the world, to leave behind a world of duties and responsibilities and go away into a forest or hermitage. There is nothing like that. We can live in this world without being in this world, without being worldly minded. So his central thesis is, with one hand you take the name of God, the holy name of God, take refuge in God. With the other hand, you work in the world. So see, a synthesis of the secular and spiritual. In this way, we can spiritualize our whole life. That is Sri Ramakrishna's central teaching. Now you can, you have any suggestion to make, I can deal with the text according to some of your suggestions, or I shall read the beginning, the first chapter of the text. If any suggestion from anybody?
Could you tell us a little bit about how he put the book together? I seem to remember that he had a prodigious memory.
Yes.
And that he would keep a lot of this inside.
Yes.
And without writing things down there, he would go home, wouldn't he?
Yes, he used to.
Could you tell us a little bit about
Yes. He, as I said, he had a prodigious memory, and he used to closely listen to the conversations going on in that small room where Sri Ramakrishna was living. Sri Ramakrishna's instructions to his disciples. Sometimes total strangers, sometimes agnostics, sometimes atheists, sometimes well-educated people, ultra-modern people who rejected God and religion and everything, and sometimes very conservative Orthodox people. So all these people used to go to Sri Ramakrishna. Among the visitors to Sri Ramakrishna's room, you can find nihilists and atheists. In the 19th century, many of these anarchist movements and nihilist movements had their repercussions in India's intellectual climate as well. Marxism had not become a political ideology, but as a socio-political ideology, it had some influence among the intellectuals. And Darwin also had his followers in the city of Calcutta. Positivists also had their followers. So they were not willing to accept God or religion or spirituality or anything. But they were ready to accept something universal. You can find some of them sitting in the room listening to Sri Ramakrishna. And they were very, very conservative Orthodox people. Sivanatha Shastri, great Sanskrit scholar. Tradition-bound, convention-bound people. The relics of the old India, They also used to go to Sri Ramakrishna. And there were young students from the universities and colleges who had imbibed the best of Western literature and history and culture, and who had not bothered much about India's traditional spiritual wisdom. They also used to go to Sri Ramakrishna. In fact, one of his most eminent followers was Keshav Chandra Sen, who was the leader of Brahma Samaj. He was perhaps the leader of the elite of Calcutta city at that time, Brahma Samaj leader. And he believed in God, but his religion was an amalgam of Unitarian universalism, and Upanishadic philosophy. He had broad-minded ideas, but he did not believe in temple worship. He would go to the Dakshineshwar and go straight to Sri Ramakrishna's room without visiting the temple. So like that. And there were conservative people who came there just to visit the holy temple. So all kinds of people used to go to Sri Ramakrishna. So they will ask questions to him. Sometimes traders and businessmen used to go to him. They will ask him, well, you are talking about renunciation of lust and gold. But we are all businessmen. What will happen to us? Sri Ramakrishna would tell them, well, you don't have to close your shop and go to a forest. You run your shop, do your work. At the same time, once a while, you go to a holy man or a holy woman, a temple or a church, or read a holy book. Or if that all these things are impossible, in your own home, go to your own room, close the doors and windows, and think of God. So Sri Ramakrishna used to give instructions to his disciples according to their position. He will come down to their level and then give them a lift. He never preached from a distance, from above. That's the most unique aspect of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. He was intensely practical, intensely humane. He will come down to the grossest level of a beginner in spiritual life and give them an idea, and then slowly lift them to a higher and higher level of spiritual consciousness without disturbing their own inherent tendencies and characteristics. That was Sri Ramakrishna's uniqueness. Now, M used to listen to all these conversations, and then after closely listening to them, he will go home and he will record all these instructions in his own personal diaries, which he later brought down in the form of Sri Kothamada. Kothamada means the Bengali Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. In fact, perhaps in 1908, he published an English version of his own instructions, translated by him into English from Bengali. That is the first English presentation, which now in a slightly different form you can get it as a condensed Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, published from Madras Math. So, and these diaries put together came to be known as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. That's the beginning of the book. M's life itself gives us a clue as to how to approach this book. So if you turn to any page in this book, you can see there is a message for all of us. No matter what profession, what religion, what culture we belong to, all of us can get something from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. M himself used to compare himself to somebody sitting near the Ganga with the store of holy water. So anybody who went to him, he will take a few drops of the Ganga water and give him. Something that purifies, something that gives us a new light in spiritual life. So that's the idea. Any other suggestions? The beginning, any?
Is there any way to look at it differently in these times compared to the time and culture it was written in?
Oh, yes. Well, looking at the book from today's perspective, you find Sri Ramakrishna is intensely positive, never negative. Though he speaks about God, which is after all in a purely theistic idea, he is speaking about the God of all humanity, not of God of one particular religion or one particular group or nation. Sri Ramakrishna is speaking about a kind of universal spiritual humanism. So from our own times, we can say life should be taken as an integrated whole. That's the message, not in fragments. So very often we become worried when we look upon our life as a fragment, an isolated event. But if life can be taken as one integral whole, we can face its problems. I'm not going to the Vedantic aspect of it. What I'm trying to tell you is, life as a whole can be integrated by combining the secular and spiritual. Secular should not be separated from the spiritual. That's why Sri Ramakrishna says, whatever we do, if we do that with a prayer in our mind, taking the holy name, with total dedication, then that work becomes a spiritual practice. So in that way, the spirituality and secularism they are not two aspects of one life. So the secular merges in spiritual. Perhaps that's one way to look at it from today's point of view. And second point is, it is very, very practical. Whatever we do, Sri Ramakrishna, as I gave an example just now, it's a businessman. Normally, normally we think business or industry or some professions are not so spiritual. Those professions demand concentration and focusing on money, profits, and secular benefits, and so on. So they are not very good. But Sri Ramakrishna says all these can be spiritualized if we do it with a sense of duty and a sense of prayer, a prayerful attitude within. That's why when businessmen came to him and asked him, we are all business people, we are making profits, we are thinking about money only all the time, so is there any way to get away from this? So Sri Ramakrishna doesn't tell them to close their shop and go away. What he tells them, you do that, but once a while you go to a holy place, read some holy book, and that will help you in leading a spiritual life. Even if they are too profit-oriented, too money-oriented, that money orientation, maybe the profit motive, will be reduced and they will become more and more spiritual as they combine their secular worldly activities along with some kind of spiritual practice. Not that this is for all. It means even those who are conventionally engaged in non-spiritual activities like business can practice spirituality by combining some aspect of spiritual practice. That's what it means. A classic example, one of Sri Ramakrishna's greatest late disciples was Girish Chandra Ghosh. He was a bohemian, a profligate, a drunkard, who never cared for religion or spirituality. He was a dramatist, a play writer, supposed to be the father of modern Bengali theatre. So, he was some kind of a perverted genius of those days, who led a very, very bohemian life. So he came to Sri Ramakrishna. In some books it stated when he found Sri Ramakrishna was in a spiritually charged mood, ecstatic mood, he thought Sri Ramakrishna is very much like him because he used to reach that kind of ecstatic mood, not by spiritual practice, by some alcoholic drinks. So soon he understood that Sri Ramakrishna belonged to a different category. And then he also wanted some instruction. Now, what instruction will you give to a person who spends most of his time with alcoholic drinks and engaged in activities which are perhaps not, in those days in a conventional society, not supposed to be very desirable. Now, this man did not go empty-handed. That's the uniqueness of it. Even Girishchandra Ghosh got something from Sri Ramakrishna, something very substantial that made him a saint. Now Sri Ramakrishna told him, first, you take the name of God in the morning and evening. That's of course that he said it's not possible for him because he never knew when the sun rose in the east and one set in the west. He was something like Fyodor Dostoevsky. So, and then at least once in life, that also he said, well, he can't give word, he can't give a promise. But Sri Ramakrishna understood that this man openly admits that he won't be able to practice his instructions. Mm-hmm. Then he understood he is a man of integrity. Mm-hmm. With all his other, sometimes you find modern ultra-rationalists, nihilists, anarchists, but they will have some wonderful qualities. Mm-hmm. Now, Sri Ramakrishna understood. And then Sri Ramakrishna told him, well, you hand over your spiritual responsibility to me, power of attorney. He didn't really understand what it really implied, giving power of attorney. In business or in property transactions, he may have understood, but not in spiritual life. Handing over power of attorney. Anyhow, he readily admitted, agreed, and that was the beginning of a new life in his history. He became a new man. After that, he could not physically or mentally do anything wrong, anything immoral. And he became a saint. So, one important message for our times is that one should never be worried about our fate or destiny or anything. Even the most destitute, even the most so-called degraded, not really degraded people have a chance, can start a new life in spirituality. That's what it implies. And Sri Ramakrishna says, if you take the name of God, then you need not worry about anything. Sincerely, if you can do that, just think of it. See, one word that Sri Ramakrishna could never tolerate was sin. Mm-hmm. He said, in his own language, he said, well, you have taken the name of God, then how can you consider yourself to be a sinner? If you sincerely take the name of God, surrender to God, then surrendering to God and sinfulness cannot go together. If you are a sinner, then you are away from God. If you are surrendered yourself to God, then you are away from sinfulness. So, sometimes he gives this very, very encouraging promise. You assert, I have taken the name of God, so how can you be a sinner? Now, if one can sincerely practice this, that very moment one can become spiritually enlightened. But we must have so much of faith, strong faith in the name of God, very often. The intensity of faith is essential in clearly understanding the implication. I have taken the name of God, so how can I be a sinner? How can I get lost? That is Sri Ramakrishna's message. Now this is very universal. Here Sri Ramakrishna is not talking about one particular God or one particular religion or one particular cultural or spiritual tradition. It's purely universal. It could be practiced by a Christian, by a Muslim, by a Buddhist, by anybody. That is the uniqueness of this message. And I think it's very universal. I have taken the name of God. I have taken the spiritual life. So how can I get lost? That's the idea. Any other suggestions?
I seem to remember that Ramakrishna knew that M was going to record these conversations, and wouldn't he sometimes look at him and say, M, take note of this, would you?
Yes.
I mean,
yes,
he knew somehow that
this
was going to happen.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. In the Gospel you find Sri Ramakrishna sometimes asked him to repeat what he said.
Yeah, to make sure it was
And then ask him for 3-4 days back, you said something, you repeat that again.
okay.
And Yam sometimes will remind Sri Ramakrishna, this was what you were telling the other group maybe a few days earlier. Then Sri Ramakrishna would, oh, is it so? Then repeat it. So you can, Sri Ramakrishna had an inkling, he had an idea that he was man going
This
to
was
do
gonna
something.
happen,
Yes,
yes.
yes, yes. And Sri Ramakrishna in one context says about with regard to Yam, those whom God wants to spread his message, they will keep him in bondage. The idea is to be needs some interpretation. And he used the word Bhagavata. Bhagavata actually is it's a classical spiritual classic which describes the life and teachings and different aspects of Sri Krishna. Sri Krishna, one of the incarnations, the greatest Hindu incarnations. And now Sri Ramakrishna once said that those whom God wants to make use of as his tool for spreading his teachings, he may keep that person in some kind of bondage. If he becomes a mendicant, a wandering monk, he may not do that. In fact, Yam often expressed the desire to become a monk. And Sri Ramakrishna did not approve of that. He didn't approve of that. After all, some kind of bondage, some kind of what appears to be bondage is necessary to stick to this world and do work in this world. Just as sometimes some kind of crisis, a problem or a dilemma is necessary for one to get distracted, to move away from worldliness and to move towards God and spirituality. It happened. It happened in the lives of many great saints. Some unpleasant event, struggling hard for achieving something and total disappointment. These incidents sometimes become opportunities in spiritual life. It becomes helpful in spiritual life. So in Yam's case, Sri Ramakrishna wanted to keep him within that level. He didn't want him to become a monk. Sri Ramakrishna talked about monasticism to some of his disciples like Vivekananda, Narendra Datta, but not to Yam. Yam wanted to be a monk. Sri Ramakrishna didn't approve of that. So perhaps he had an inkling that this man was going to be the chronicler of his teachings. That's the idea.
Sri Ramakrishna says that for this age, devotion is an easier path.
Yes.
But if someone is more inclined to not so much ritualistic and all that, but want to approach God or the higher being in an impersonal way,
Yes.
how would you go about reading the gospel? Because most of the songs also they describe the glories of God,
Yes.
and singing with the Lord and doing for the Lord and waiting and weeping for the Lord, or in a very personal way. How would one look at it in an impersonal, or if you're I don't want to deal with rituals, how
Yes.
would we go about that?
Yes, Ramakrishna says bhakti or devotion is the easiest path for this age. What he means is bhakti is easier and simpler to practice. And jnanam, the path of knowledge, demands a lot of austerities, a lot of strong will, rational thinking. All these are required to be a Vedantin. But in devotion, you can surrender to God. You can take the name of God with total dedication, total self-surrender. Self-surrender doesn't demand anything. So it's like a child going to its mother. The mother doesn't demand anything. So, that way bhakti is simple. But at the same time, in the beginning of the Gospel, you find when Sri Ramakrishna asked Yam whether he was a follower of the path of devotion, God with form, or the path of knowledge, God without form, Yam said, well, I believe in the path of God without form, in conceiving God without form. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, that is all right, but you should not think that the other path is wrong. In the beginning of the Gospel you find. So Sri Ramakrishna admits both, but he says by and large, for people living in this age, he gives a number of reasons, Faith may not be as strong in today's world as it was in the early days. And the external conditions also changed. So we have to get engaged in different activities, different kinds of activities, not necessarily in spiritual activities, but living in this world to make a livelihood. So all can be accommodated within the realm of devotion. It means total surrender, taking the name of God. That's possible for everyone. If you are Giri Chandra Ghosh, it's possible. See, for a man like Giri Chandra Ghosh, what will he do? Brahman alone is the reality. He won't understand it. So it needs a very high level of moral background to understand higher philosophy. Both will reach the same goal. And remember, Sri Ramakrishna says, more than once he says, pure devotion and pure knowledge ultimately are the same. Pure devotion and pure knowledge is found in the Gospel, in the commentary Shankaracharya, I find. The same idea Shankaracharya repeats more than once in the commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. At the experience level, the highest devotion and highest knowledge are the same. When you look upon them as means, they may be different, but as the goal, they are the same. So in that way, for the general people, he says, well, devotion is simple. But that devotion doesn't mean that one should turn our back against other paths. That's the idea.
So devotion means, I'm using this word loosely without fully understanding it. When Sri Ramakrishna says devotion, it is not blind devotion as in, okay, I give you fruit today, okay, I have to do this fruit and flower this morning, and then I run out to my office. That is what I'm saying, blind devotion. As opposed to really, okay, even if you're very ritualistic, you think it is not this picture, this black and white picture, what it represents, what is behind, to have that, instead of doing it in a robotic way versus doing it consciously.
Yeah.
So Ramakrishna refers to the second as devotion, blindly doing it.
Yes, but there somebody asked him this question. Then he said, faith, in a way, faith in its ultimate and purest form cannot be differentiated, the blind faith or conscious faith. That's why he said, a child turning to its mother. For example, give the example, a poor woman working in a rich man's home as a child, and the rich man also has a child. Suppose both are fighting. The child may turn to its mother for protection, though actually the mother is herself helpless in a way. But when the child turns to his mother, there is complete and total conviction that mother is the protector. That kind of faith we must have. That's what Sri Ramakrishna says. Or, see, the love of a mother to its child, the love of a greedy man for money, and many things he combines. So whatever total dedication, devotion we can develop towards an object, It goes beyond blind faith or conscious faith. It goes beyond both. If you ask a child's faith in mother, it is not conscious. At the same time, it is not blind. It goes beyond both. When we use the word blind faith, it means somebody who cannot totally surrender, does something in a mechanical manner. That is called blind. But in Sri Ramakrishna's language, it means complete total surrender, which goes beyond blind faith and also conscious faith. It's neither blind nor conscious. That's why a child turning to his mother doesn't ask any question. For him or for her, mother is all. If one can have that kind of faith, then there's no problem. What Sri Ramakrishna always objected was a kind of duplicity, mental duplicity, which child doesn't have. That's why he uses the imagery of a child turning his mother. Child alone can have that kind of total surrender. So that's why in Vedantic tradition, in Bhakti tradition, this kind of surrender has got six components. Vedanta, according to Bhakti philosophers. One is always thinking of God in positive terms and rejecting negative thought currents, and the total conviction that God is the one protector, and then God is the only protector, and then complete surrender to God, and a total aversion towards anything which comes in the way of spiritual life. If one can combine all these six, this becomes it's called prabhati or saranagati, total surrender. Sri Ramakrishna, if one wants to reach the ultimate goal through devotion, this pure devotion is simple. It's possible for all. That's why you find many of the devotional bhakti movements which came to America during the post-World War days, after Second World War. They caught up and especially after Vietnam War and all that, large number of people came because people were terribly frustrated. Post-war traumatic conditions. They got something and that they were drawn towards that. Take the Hare Krishna immediately. They got. Whether it take you the ultimate goal or not, that's a different matter. Mind should be so pure, so completely dedicated to get any spiritual benefit from that, but it has got a special attraction. Complete dedication, self-surrender to God, without asking any questions, without any demands. It's got a special attraction. In the first place, it is very simple. In the second place, it doesn't demand any effort on our part. That's one thing. Yes.
Also, it requires tremendous strength, right, Swami? Like, if a jnani says, oh, I'm going to discriminate, I'm going to develop my willpower, but to surrender is not easy. You have to have tremendous strength to say no to the other things and always say yes only to God.
When you surrender, you don't have to say yes or no, because the surrender itself will take care of everything else. So you don't have to make any special effort to move away from the East if you completely move towards the West. Moving towards the West involves moving away from the East. So total surrender is like moving towards the West. So you don't have to say no to anything else. In fact, that was why Girish Chandra Ghosh thought it is the right thing for him. Though he did not really understand it. He really did not really understand it. But because of his total faith, total integrity, it worked. It may not work for all. Because for that, we must... see, in spiritual life, there is one principle. If at this split second, if we can totally surrender to God, we can open a new life, a new chapter in our life. But that should be 100% total. But whether that's possible, it becomes possible, it is possible sometimes when certain circumstances come together. See, think of Saint Francis of Assisi, which is just imagine. His own father came and scolded him, and you think of many great saints who had some experiences in their life which made them, which forced them to move towards the west, towards God, which naturally took them away from the east. So sometimes by force of circumstances, people may suddenly start a new chapter in their life. This happens in many spiritual aspirants. For others, studying a Vedanta or Vedas and conviction, that could be one other path. Sri Ramakrishna, in fact, this is related to what Marian was asking earlier. In this age, total surrender is possible for the simple-hearted people. Total surrender. Is it possible now? Because it doesn't demand anything. You raise this question for our own times. Total. See, you take the name of God, then why should you worry about anything? I have taken the name of Durga, so why should I be worried about anything? I cannot be a sinner. If a person can have the strong conviction that taking the name of God can purge of all sins, then that very moment all the sins will be purged off. In fact, that is the psychology behind the concept of confession. Augustine writes in the Confessions, famous, is classic. So, if we can have total faith, well, I have taken the name of God, nothing will happen. Then that moment we become, all the sins will be washed off. So total surrender is psychologically very, very easy, but for those who have got a very high level of integrity, that's the idea behind.
Some people talk about surrendering over and over again.
That means they have not surrendered earlier. Renewal of surrender, it means they never surrender.
Exactly. So the idea of surrender.
But I tell you, but we should not oversimplify this fact. In fact, getting more and more familiar with these concepts will help us to reach the level of true surrender. Because if mind is not ready, it may be possible, well, I have not really surrendered, though I have surrendered. But then, if one goes on reading scriptures and spiritual practices continuously, then we'll reach a level where surrender really becomes real. So that will help us. That's everybody cannot be like Girichandra Ghosh, because in his case he had hit the rock bottom. He can't go further down. Now next moment is only upward moment. So that kind of total state of total helplessness produces an intensity of devotion. But if he is sincere, it becomes spiritually very beneficial.
You said like intense devotion, like when Vanita brought up that which is devotion, that which is knowledge. If someone is more inclined toward the path of knowledge, what then does it mean about surrendering to God?
It's for somebody who's
is more inclined to or following, say, a path of knowledge, yoga, and it's when they say surrender to God, how would that appear to someone who is God without form?
Yes, the idea of total surrender doesn't occur in the concept. In the concept of path of knowledge. In path of knowledge, we are analyzing the reality. When we analyze the world around us, the phenomenal world, we find everything is changing. These changing things cannot be absolutely real. And our senses, our mind, our intellect, this body, everything undergoes changes. So a true scientist can just give a new turn to his scientific analysis, and he can reach the path of knowledge. But at intellectual level, so in path of knowledge, surrender doesn't occur. God without form means the path of knowledge. I mean, conceiving Brahman as the absolute reality, Brahman as the immanent, the omnipresent, transcendental reality, which is everywhere, all-pervading reality, and which is eternal, which is timeless, which is infinite, which is never born, which never dies. Now this is possible if you just analyze the world in which we are living. The world is, after all, as perishable, as momentary as ants or insects. Insects may live maybe for a few days or maybe minutes or hours, and the world may exist maybe for a few millions of years. So both belong to time. Both are limited by time. Both live in time. So they are limited. They are relative. They are not absolute. So what is the absolute reality? Something which goes beyond all this. That is the absolute reality. So that reality is within me. It is also the all-pervading reality. This analysis becomes logical if it is followed by certain spiritual disciplines like discrimination between the real and unreal and a strong desire for liberation. If all these characteristics and qualities are there, then this analysis becomes logical. Otherwise it becomes like Kantian or utilitarian philosophy. So that's why very often devotional path is recommended as the easiest path for this time. Sri Ramakrishna makes it very clear. Sometimes, our intellectual ego may not permit us to become devotees. We have an inherent feeling that path of knowledge is superior to path of devotion. Now, Sri Ramakrishna says it is not so. It is a matter of our spiritual evolution, not a choice. In spirituality, if our choice and our evolution are the same, it becomes easy. But very often our choice may not be exactly in tune with our own spiritual evolution, growth. Then it creates conflicts. That's why Sri Ramakrishna says devotion is the easiest path. And he says Narada's bhakti. Narada was an ancient philosopher of bhakti, devotion philosophy. He said, taking the name of God is the easiest, simplest, surest path leading to the ultimate God, with total dedication and devotion. That's the idea.
Self is beyond name and form.
Yes.
So how does name matter in these things at all? It is just a sound.
Yes, the self in devotion philosophy is often conceived as what we call in Sanskrit Saguna Sakara, means a God with a name, form and attributes. Those who have got a devotion temperament should think of God as somebody who creates this world, who is compassionate, who is looking after you, who has got a name, who has got a certain characteristics. Those who have got a devotion temper. That's why Sri Ramakrishna doesn't recommend the same path for all. He says our path depends upon our temperament. He gives the famous example, mother cooks fish to suit the taste of all her children. Some children may like different varieties, different preparations. So mother doesn't give the same dish to all her children. A baby may require one kind of dish, maybe grown-up young man may require different kind of dish. Not that one is inferior, other is superior. The same baby, when he grows up, will eat something else later. So, in devotion philosophy, God is perceived, the same self or Atman or Brahman is perceived as endowed, as being endowed with a name, form, certain attributes, and you can realize his existence by taking the holy name with complete dedication. Sri Ramakrishna in his own life synthesized all this. In fact, in Gospel you can find a wonderful synthesis between the path of knowledge and path of devotion. not at the philosophical level, at the experience level. Sri Ramakrishna says, at the experience level only you can find this reconciliation. At the philosophical, logical level, you can never synthesize, harmonize the path of devotion and the path of knowledge. Experience level. So the moment we get experience, then all conflicts come to an end, not before. That's why he said, experience can never be explained. These Vedic Upanishadic truths are most beautifully explained by Sri Ramakrishna. He said, Brahman is the only thing which has not become Uchishta. Uchishta means something that you already eaten. If you take a piece of bread and you eat one part of it, leave the rest, what is left out is called Uchishta. Now, Brahman is the only reality which is not Uchishta, means Brahman is the only reality which remains unexplained, untouched by words, because it can only be experienced. So when we reach the level of experience, the path of knowledge and the path of devotion, they converge. Not till then. That's why in his own life he practiced all this. And he recommended all these various paths to various disciples. And he instructed them according to their level of spiritual growth. For everyone. You can just imagine a Western professor teaching excursion wanted his students to go to Sri Ramakrishna to understand the true implication of the word trance used by William Wordsworth. That's something very interesting. We don't know, we had no clue when that professor must have gone to Dakshineshwar. And remember about Gospel, we have to remember a very, very important thing. Yam did not visit Dakshineshwar every day. Whenever he got time, he was a teacher. Whenever he was on holidays, whenever he got time, he visited. What about Sri Ramakrishna's instructions to other disciples and for visitors who frequented Dakshineshwar temple, who visited him? We have no way to know. So Gospel in a way constitutes a very small fraction of what all Sri Ramakrishna must have taught in his life. So perhaps some of them must have visited Dakshineshwar. And they may have seen him something which Wordsworth tried to explain. That's the idea behind. Yes.
Do you have to choose a path and follow it completely, or you can mix and match two paths like 10%? Because you'll get, if you eat the same kind of fish every day, you'll get bored.
Yeah. Yes.
So it's kind of difficult just to follow Jnana Yoga or Bhakti Yoga all the time.
Yes.
Or do you think that's necessary, that you have to follow one path and till it leads to the ultimate goal?
Yeah, when we sincerely enter one path, then we won't feel there's any conflict. When we enter spiritual life, see, suppose you start praying, you start the path of walking to the path of devotion, following the path of devotion, then you won't be adverse to reading Upanishads or books on Vedanta, because Upanishads tell reality is one. Is the only absolute reality. For somebody who follows the path of devotion, God is the absolute reality. Okay. Now, in devotion philosophy, that absolute reality is endowed with name, form, etc. The Upanishads do not contradict that view. Upanishad says there is a higher view when the same reality can be realized as being devoid of, not being limited by names and forms. So when we really enter spiritual life, the conflict doesn't arise. Conflicts exist only before we enter. When we sincerely start praying on meditation, then we won't mind if we read Upanishads. After all, in the great classics you find all these great spiritual personalities, they were teaching only Upanishads. God with form is also part of Upanishadic philosophy. It's not in conflict with that. But what Sri Ramakrishna says is, depending upon our temperament, we have to choose a path. If we are brought up in a family where we are trained to worship, trained to meditate on a God with form, we need not all of a sudden take a new life, be attracted by the path of knowledge. We can follow that path. And once we start in our real spiritual life, the conflict disappears. That's the idea. Sri Ramakrishna refers to this point. See, if you sit in the bank of a river and say, I want to cross the river, I want to cross the river, you go on shouting, you won't be able to do that. Then he says you have to untie the chains that binds the boat to the anchor. Then you have to row for some time till you reach midstream, and then you find the wind that is blowing will take you to proper direction. So the moment, that's why in Sri Ramakrishna's Gospel, one of the most unique teachings is the synthesis, the harmonization between human effort and God's grace. Human effort in a way corresponds to knowledge because it needs analysis, self-analysis, and God's grace. Taking the same analogy from the Gospel, we can say. Now, when you want to cross the river, you want to make use of the boat. So you should untie the chain that binds the boat to the anchor. And then you should row for some time. Then you reach the midstream. Then you can take advantage of the wind that is blowing. Now, the wind corresponds to God's grace. The effort involved till we reach the midstream corresponds to human effort. And I mean, rowing, reaching the midstream, which requires human effort. So without human effort, you find, we will not be able to fully understand and appreciate God's grace. That's not possible. Because human effort, our effort, self-effort, it prepares our mind to fully understand the implication of divine grace. Not before that. So some kind of struggle, some kind of effort on our part, that only make us ready for understanding God's grace.
Swami, does the boat analogy also in some way equate to having a guru, but the guru is really within yourself? Like in the Gospel too, he says, you must have a teacher to move you along, and yet don't call me teacher because the teacher's in you. So is that sort of like the boat example of the teacher will help you lift the anchor, row the boat, and then
Yes. The Guru's instructions, then reading scriptures, our own regular spiritual practice, pilgrimages, or regular reading of certain sacred books, discussion among fellow our fellow pilgrims in spiritual life. All these correspond to effort. Because beyond that level, we find we are being guided by the absolute reality, by God Himself.
So when one, say, enters a path with a guru or teacher, and yet that teacher will tell you, I am not your teacher, what does that relationship establish for you and your path and direction?
Oh, you mean, who tells you that?
Well, take for instance, even Guru Purnima especially, the talks usually say, you have to have a teacher in order to progress in the spiritual path, and yet there is no teacher except yourself.
Oh, yes.
Ramakrishna said, "Do not call me your guru."
Yes, yes. No,
And yet they say
yes.
you do need one to get to
That's
a
right.
certain-
That's right. Sri Ramakrishna says, for a beginner in spiritual life should get instruction from a spiritual person, from a guru, and follows his instructions. And as we advance in spiritual life, following these instructions, slowly you find a kind of inherent mechanism, a kind of compass develops in us, which takes us along the path of spiritual life. In our tradition, for example, we have to consider ourselves to be the recipients of the grace of Sri Ramakrishna. That's our tradition. So if you follow that path, then within ourselves we find there is a inner mechanism which guides us along the path. That's what Sri Ramakrishna means when the self itself becomes the guru. He said that the mind becomes the guru. Mind, he said the mind. But that's not the ordinary mind. That mind is different. That mind is the mind which is saturated by spiritual ideas, which has undergone a lot of spiritual practice. That's the idea. Yes. I may just read this discussion occurs in the beginning itself. See. See, Sri Ramakrishna asked him the question, well, do you believe in God with form or without form? In fact, this conversation brings out the essence of what we are discussing so far. Yam, rather surprised, said to himself, how can one believe in God without form when one believes in God with form? And if one believes in God without form, how can one believe that God has a form? Can these two contradictory ideas be true at the same time? Can a white liquid like milk be black? Now, this shows that Yam not fully grasped the idea that God with form and God without form are two ideas which occur to two spiritual aspirants, seekers belonging to two different levels. There is no contradiction. See, when Sri Ramakrishna asked this question, do you believe in God with form or without form? So can God be with and without form both? Now, that's because he was brought up in the theistic, monotheistic Abrahamic tradition. Yam was a member of the Brahma Samaj, and Brahma Samaj had imbibed many of the ideas of Unitarian Abrahamic traditions. So there, God has a definite form, a function. But Yam also had read Vedanta, Upanishad philosophy, which says that God is beyond, God is without form, without name. But actually Vedanta doesn't say God is without name, without form. Vedanta says the absolute reality goes beyond both, but doesn't contradict the idea of God with form. It's an inclusive concept, not an exclusive concept. Yam brackets both of them in one category, which is really not true. A person who has reached a particular level of spiritual growth can grasp the idea of God, which is not confined or limited by names, forms, characteristics, etc., which goes beyond all that. In fact, this idea comes in Eckhart also. It is not special to Upanishad philosophy. In Eckhart also this idea comes. The absolute reality going beyond the inexplicability, indescribability, all that you find. And M still is obsessed with the idea that God with form is one concept and God without form is another concept. Both are two parallel concepts, which is wrong. In Vedanta, there is no contradiction between these two concepts. The moment you realize that the reality of God which goes beyond form, you also realize that it is not in conflict with the idea of God with form. But you have to reach the experience level, not the philosophy level. At the logical level, from rational analysis, these are two parallel, mutually contradictory concepts. I am himself, M's soliloquy is mental, his impressions are recorded here. How can God be with form and without form? If God is with form, then how can you believe that there could be a God without form? But the reality is, the moment you experience, then you understand there is no conflict. From a philosophical angle, there appears to be conflict.
The experience itself is in the realm of duality, isn't it?
Yes, but then at that experience, you don't. It is a subjective experience, an experience minus objects. It is, see, generally when we call experience, there is objectification of something, subject-object differentiation. But in Advaita tradition, in the path of knowledge, there is no subject-object differentiation. It is called experience because we can't call it anything else. Sometimes called subjective because it is not objective. In that sense, it's called subjective. So it goes beyond subject-object differentiation. That's the main difference. So the moment, see, I can give an example. In Sri Ramakrishna's own experience, see, when Totapuri was taking Sri Ramakrishna along the path of knowledge, the path of formless reality, at one point, Sri Ramakrishna found it very difficult to go beyond the form, beyond the idea of God with form. Then Totapuri took a piece of crystal glass from somewhere and pressed here and asked him to meditate here. And then asked him to meditate on the supreme reality which goes beyond names and forms. And then the image vanished. But there Sri Ramakrishna understood it is not in contradiction, it goes beyond it. Going beyond is different from coming in conflict with something else. That's the main difference. So, something which goes beyond becomes all inclusive. It is not in conflict with anything else. That's the main difference. M at this point has not understood this fact. Of course, gradually he will understand. M evolves. M also evolves in his spiritual life. That's the idea behind. That's why Sri Ramakrishna says Vedanta is not in conflict with any ideas. So even the most primitive idea of God and religion and spirituality, what we normally call primitive, that also has got a spiritual content in it. If the seeker is sincere, that's the idea. So there cannot be anything like a wrong religion, wrong path. If the seeker is sincere, then the path is fine. That's what Sri Ramakrishna says. It's so universal. In fact, if there is anything unique to Gospel and to Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, it is this. There is nothing negative in it. Everything is positive. This is what Swamiji taught in the West. No negation. No rejection of anything. See, in answer to this, Sri Ramakrishna says, very good. It's enough to have faith in either aspects. You believe in God without form, that is quite all right. But never for a moment think that this alone is true and all else false. That's the idea behind. Remember that God with form is just as true as God without form. but hold fast to your own conviction. That's the idea. One need not change one's conviction, but should not. But true conviction, when it reaches the experience level, doesn't produce any fanaticism or narrow-mindedness. That's what it implies. We have just 5 minutes if there is anything to discuss. Here, Sri Ramakrishna is taking this image. See, the mother cooks different dishes to soothe the stomachs of her different children. Suppose she has 5 children. If there is a fish to cook, she prepares various dishes from it. Pickled fish, fried fish, and so on, to suit their different tastes and powers of digestion. Sri Ramakrishna used another technique, as a chronicler. Do you understand me? M says, yes, sir. How, sir, may we fix our minds on God? So, as you referred to earlier, he makes it sure, he wants to ensure that M listens carefully and understands everything properly. That's why he had a predisposition that M was going to be the chronicler.
Like a premonition.
Yes, it should be something.
Spiritual premonition.
Yes. The evening we'll read again and we'll discuss. Okay.
The gospel, I suppose one of the most important things it does is help us see how to practice these truths, right? How to practice devotion and knowledge. As we listen and ponder and meditate on what Ramakrishna says, we see how to live it better.
Yes.
Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's true.
Do you have time for one?
Yes.
Going back to bhakti being the broadly prescribed path for this age, 2 things. I don't know if this is a deviation. 2 things. One is, why is Advaita a hard practice for this age? And was there an age? And in which age was it a common practice? Advaita was
The path of knowledge.
Yeah.
Sri Ramakrishna in one context says, in ancient times the sages used to practice the path of knowledge. He is referring to a time and an age in which there were our activities and duties and responsibilities were not multifold. Kings used to give up their thrones and go into forest and meditate. He is referring to perhaps the Upanishadic age from a historical perspective. In the mythical perspective, they say Satya Yuga and so on. But it could be the Upanishadic age, during which great spiritual seekers used to give up everything and travel hundreds of miles in search of the teachers and learn the Upanishads and meditate in forest. That's what we find in the Upanishad literature. The Upanishad literature gives the picture of the social life of those days. It was very common. In the Prashna Upanishad, you find 6 youngsters coming from all over India, the Himalayas, in the forest, and asking 6 questions. And the great sage Pippala answers all these questions. So you find in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad the great king Janaka and Yajnavalkya, the great philosopher, the great sage, discussing various philosophical questions. This you find in Chandogya Upanishad and so on. So the whole Upanishadic literature gives the picture of the social, spiritual life of those days. Saints and sages leaving their homes, some of them kings and emperors leaving their kingdoms, going to forest in search of great philosophers, learning philosophy from them, practicing meditation, and themselves becoming teachers, teaching their disciples. This long succession you find. In those days there was nothing else to do. But Sri Ramakrishna lived in the latter half of 19th century, from 1836 to 1886. So it was very modern. It was the perhaps it was a post-industrial age, and philosophically that was the age when all these new anarchist, nihilistic ideas were spreading, and people had various things to do, secular activities. So in the midst of all these activities, what to do? Can we go to the forest? We can't do. So Sri Ramakrishna, live in the world, need not run away from the world, but make use of this life as an opportunity to lead a spiritual life by combining the secular and spiritual. In one context, he said, touch the feet of the God on one hand and work with the other hand in this world. So combining the spiritual and secular. That's what he says. Yes. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.